Good afternoon, everybody. Hi, I'm Paul. This afternoon, this session is about product requirements lifecycle. So looking at how you translate from a business need into software requirements. So it's the perspective of a product manager or product owner. It's meant to be an interactive session. So if you see something that you have more questions about or you want to learn a little bit more, feel free to stop me at any time during the presentation. So to start, I captured this title. Some of you may have seen one of our clients, Simon from Petzilla, speaking earlier today, or their product, the Petzilla pet device. Just as an example, many times when I'm talking with clients very early in the relationship, I'll often get a question something like this: Paul, I want to build something that's basically more or less Facebook for dogs. So how expensive is it going to be? How much is it going to cost? And how soon can I deliver it? Can I deliver that in September, do you think? and I say, yeah, that's an interesting question. The answer is probably yes, but but it all depends on how you interpret the requirements, right? There's a lot more detail that's required to really understand what's possible and how long something's going to take. But it illustrates the problem that business people are faced with talking with their managers or talking with investors about the application. Very often you have to describe what the application is going to do before you know what the application is going to do. So that's the problem that I'll talk about, how different ways you can approach that and how you can solve this problem. And how product owners work their magic. How many people are familiar with Scrum? Many? Okay. So I won't spend a lot of time on this. I'll do just a small review. The idea with Scrum, the green wheel in the middle is the Scrum cycle. So there's a daily cycle, the very little one, where you're taking a chunk of work, working on it. When it's finished, it goes into the pile on the right. And then the bigger cycle, which is the sprint or the iteration for the release. What we're going to be talking about are the pieces to the left, the product backlog that turns into sprint backlog that eventually turns into the wheel, comes out as a potentially shippable piece of software. So we'll talk a little about how we plan requirements at the product level and then at the sprint and user story level and how those things tie together. So I'll start at the very smallest building block first, and then we'll sort of go to the top of the cycle. So the smallest building block is the user story. And this is the canonical form of the user story. The standard form is as some kind of user. I want to accomplish some goal or perform some action, and that offers some business purpose or some business value. Each of these pieces is important because it's important to know what kind of user are you talking about. Is your user my mother, who learned to use a computer maybe 3 years ago and can do email, and that's about it? Or is your user my son, who at 6 would take my phone and reconfigure it, and suddenly all my apps were deleted or new things were popping up that I never knew existed? So understanding the persona is very important. The second piece is the piece that is most often in the requirements. I want a feature that does this, you know, make the screen bigger, buy this product from the e-store. And then the final piece is one that's often forgotten, and that is what's the business value that this ties to? So ultimately, people are building software to accomplish some goal, either, you know, to have fun, or to make money, or to save money, or to save time, or increase efficiency. So understanding that business objective later helps. And the reason that you want all of these pieces is that you want the engineers and designers who are building the software to be able to have some flexibility, so that they know, okay, I'm building this feature, but I have a better way of doing it. Since this feature is for my mother, I think about it in a very different way as far as the user interface, or as far as the error handling or the method. So that, or if I understand the business value that it's going to achieve, I might think, well, I have a very different way to do that business value that's much more interesting. So the engineers, the designers can come back to the product owner and say, I know you asked for A, but wouldn't it be really cool if you could do B instead? It seems like that accomplishes the same value. And a lot of times it's true. So by providing a user story in this form and providing all those three pieces, it allows the engineers and designers to be creative and provide more interesting and more creative solutions. So that's the basics behind the core user story. And here's more of an IT example. As an IT manager, I want to be able to remotely configure new servers so I can reduce cost of deployment. So we know that the persona is an IT manager, that the business objective that they have is to reduce cost of deployment, and then what they want is a remote configuration tool. Make sense? Yeah. Okay. So now we're going to go back with that sort of background. Yes, question?
I have seen user stories that are like the same template, but you need to get stuck in that template, but you change it a little bit. Because I have seen user story like, as an application, and this is true, as an application, I want the rake or shell script so I can do something.
Yes.
And you know, applications don't want things.
or as a developer, I want to have a script that processes every 12 hours through cron or something, right? I'll repeat the question. The question was about user story form and can you break from the format? And the answer, the broad answer is yes, you can break from the form, but you have to be very careful because the idea behind it is to understand what the end user value is going to be. If you read it, you should understand what's the benefit to the person who's going to use the software in the end. So you can phrase it any way you want, as long as it's sort of clear what the value for the end user is, then it accomplished the goal. And sometimes you can have that, you know, as a system. I want to have a shell script that backs me up at night. Because the business purpose is pretty clear, you know, for backup, it's data security. So it's like, okay, I don't really need to say that. Everybody knows why backups are done. But you have to be careful. When it doesn't follow this form, just ask yourself, is it clear what the end user value is? If it is, it's probably okay. If it's not clear what the end user value is, then there needs to be more added to the story. And there's a little later in the presentation, I have some techniques for criteria to evaluate a user story to see, does it meet this, does it meet this, does it meet this? It's called the INVEST invest. And I'll cover that in a few minutes. That'll also help. You're welcome. So I'll start now at the top of the software lifecycle. I think we can read all that. So there's really two worlds that we're trying to meet together here, the business world and the software world. And so I've set these two side by side to identify the big software lifecycle that's happening. There's a planning. There's a time where there's planning occurring and defining the project. Then there's you're defining the project. Then there's planning that occurs, and then there's the execution of the project. And we'll talk about each of these in turn. At the define phase, on the business side, you're really trying to understand what is the business plan, what's the product roadmap, how is this going to work in the business world. From a software side, and how that translates into Scrum is building a product backlog and developing themes and epics. And I'll talk a little bit more about what are themes and epics here in just a moment. We'll go through each of these sections. And then in the plan section, on the business side, you're trying to make a plan so that you can make commitments to your customers, to your managers, to your investors about what are you going to deliver and in what kind of time frame, so that they can build a marketing plan about it, do promotions, whatever needs to happen outside of the business. In the Scrum view, there you're creating stories, doing the estimating to size the work, doing release planning, and really assessing the risk of the plan. So I have a plan in the roadmap. I'm going to deliver version 1 in October, but I don't have a plan. All I have is I know I have to deliver version 1 in October, and it has to do these things. The planning part turns that more into a concrete plan, so you can say, okay, how confident am I in delivering in October? And is it low risk or is it high risk? Do I need to change the plan and change the commitments? So the planning phase gives you a chance to test that. And then in execution, it's about building the product. So those two sort of come together. And on the business side, it's making sure that you have the right product. On the software side, it's building the product and building a good quality product. So we'll talk about defining a project first. So the idea, I think of the defining of a product as sort of a peeling of an onion. You're starting layer by layer by layer, breaking it down until you get to the inner core. At the very highest level, you're starting with a product roadmap. As I said before, quite often you have to define what you're going to build even before you know what you're going to build. So you have an idea of what you're going to do and a rough idea of the time frame, and you build that into a product roadmap. Then you break that into individual releases. So version 1, version 1.1, version 2. And then within the releases, you have particular themes of activities of things that you're going to deliver. So certain functionality, certain business problems that you can solve with version 1. And then with version 1.1, you can solve other additional problems. I also introduced here the idea of an epic. We talked about user story, and an epic is just a very large story. So the term is often used, an epic novel, like War and Peace. The book is about this thick. So that term is used also in Agile to refer to a very, very large user story. It's not very well defined yet. It may require many people and many sprints to deliver it, but it has the same characteristics as a user story. It has a persona, an action, and a business value. And those two things work together. The themes and the epics work together. And then eventually, as you peel the onion and drill down into the greater and greater level of details, you get to the user story or the individual user stories. The challenge for the product owner, the product manager, is to do this in a just-in-time fashion. So you want to stay high level for as long as is possible before you drill down. Because quite often what happens as you drill down or as you're talking to other people outside the business, you'll learn new things about the application and the idea will change. It will shift or pivot to new ideas. So if you've done a lot of work detailing out 500 user stories for how you're going to accomplish this theme, and then the theme changes completely, all those stories are a waste of time. They're just wasted work. So the art in product management is finding the right time to start drilling down from roadmap down into themes and from themes down into user stories. And it's really mostly about that final step of breaking themes down into detailed user stories. And I recommend trying to do that level of breakdown as late in the cycle as possible, basically as a function of what the engineering team needs to be able to estimate and build. But before engineering is even ready to design and estimate and build, then those stories, it's too early. Questions about this topic? Yes?
Even epic is the same thing. I haven't heard of it.
Let's see. We'll just go to this slide. You knew this slide was here, right? There's really two different things between themes and epics. So again, this is sort of the two worlds of software development and the business world. Themes are more business goals that you want to accomplish, and epics are big user stories. So epics are more what you deliver in order to accomplish the themes, and the themes are more what the user cares about. So here's an example. Theme 2, as a user, I have this very complex system and I need a simpler way to configure that system. It's too complex, it's too hard to configure. So the theme of simplifying configuration is important to me. What that translates to in implementation is really, there's two different epics that relate to this. One is for the power user. For a power user, simplifying configuration means a mass configuration. I can write a script and I can run it and it will configure 5,000 systems at once from a central location. So as a power user, that meets the theme of simplifying configuration, but it's a very specific implementation, specific feature. As a basic user, simplifying configuration means something entirely different. So for that persona, simplifying configuration is there's a wizard that asks me questions and walks me through configuration step by step by step. Both of those together achieve a theme of simpler implementation or simpler configuration. But they're actually, the feature, the actual thing that's going to be built in software. So that's how I distinguish between themes and epics. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay, sure.
So the way we work is that we see epics are way too big to be able to accomplish that in a single screen. We use those as containers, and we have like these bunch of user stories that relate to that epic.
Yes.
I don't know if that's accurate for you or false.
No, that's accurate. So really, both of these can be containers, and quite often what I see, the epic and the child story, sort of a parent-child relationship, with the epic being the container and the user stories being within it, is very common. From a product owner standpoint, there's usually also an overlay of the theme, because it may be that if you look at an Epic user story, maybe you can accomplish most of the theme by doing just the first 5 stories, and the other 5 are sort of nice to have. So quite often, in addition to the hierarchy of epic story and child stories, there's also often an overlay of themes, so that if you're doing a sprint that's all about configuration, you can go through and take all of the child stories that are related to that theme, even if they cross multiple epics. So you can have a relationship like this, where Epic B supports 2 different themes, but Epics C and A only support one theme or the other. So if your release, and the reason that the theme is valuable is when you're describing a release, it's easier and safer to describe it in the term of themes. So if I was talking about a release that was going to be around large-scale implementation, I could say to my customers, hey, in December, we're going to have a release. It's going to solve all your large-scale implementation problems. It's all about scale. It's really exciting. I can't tell you about the features exactly yet, but believe me, if you're large-scale, you are going to want this release. Everything is focused on that, all of our energy. And so if that's the case, then you would choose, epics A and B, or even the components inside those epics that accomplish large-scale integration. So you might come in and pick and choose a subset of an epic to accomplish that goal. So it's a way for the product owner to have an overlay of sort of what's the press release for this launch, what's the press release for this version going to say, and let me flag the user stories that have something to do with that, so that I can easily prioritize them and make them float to the top.
So you're basically translating into business.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah, it's sort of double identifying to be able to translate into business. Exactly. So getting to the business versus technical view, there's really 2 different views of the roadmap as well. So early in a product life cycle, you'll see a roadmap like this that's pretty typical, where you'll have versions identified and a timeline. So we're going to work on this version in January and February. We'll have another one in March and April. And then we're going to start version 2 in parallel. We'll start development on it in March. It'll ship at the end of June. From an external product roadmap standpoint, you'll typically have the themes that those versions will contain, because we really haven't, well, let's say this is a 2016 roadmap, right, for next year. So, because obviously they'd already begun. But if this is the 2016 roadmap, maybe we're starting to think about backlog for January. It's probably still too early, but for sure we haven't really put backlog in place for 6 months from now. So you want to be able to describe in general terms what that release is about, so that you can get feedback. People can say, oh yeah, that's really cool, next generation studio, we've been waiting for that. Or you may have users that say, wow, yeah, search is terrible. I really like Facebook integration, but I don't use that very much. But reporting is killing me. If I could have reporting sooner, and I could make more money, or it would save me a lot of time. So these kind of product roadmaps give you a chance to have conversation with the users and understand what their priorities are and get their reactions to it. So it's like a straw man. Hey, what do you think of this? And then it becomes more and more true, more and more solid over time as time passes. Yeah.
So on this same slide, this is about where we have a client that probably has some requirements that we need to fulfill. But what if the company is testing like a new product that there's no client for yet?
Right.
And there's no one that can tell us exactly what. Like if we're building like a first version.
Yes.
Of a rough product to see just if it works, what that criteria basically be, because we need to smash everything into the first version that needs to be built with not that kind of effort?
Yes, so the question is around a product that you really don't have a user base for yet. How do you tackle it? And a similar thing applies, but in this case, you have to have a particular market or user in mind. In the best case, even for a version 1 product, you'll have some type of a steering committee or a group of people that are part of your target that you would say, if I delivered this, what do you think? So it takes a little more imagination to get the feedback, but the main difference is you sort of identify who you think the users are going to be, and then you get their feedback.
So in that boardroom, the conversation takes place, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, sort of in the boardroom or in the steering committee that is kind of the idea behind the product.
More like an MVP.
Yes, more like an MVP. Exactly. Yep. And quite often in that scenario, you would use the tool of doing more mock-ups and prototype product to be able to give them a feel for what it can actually do. If it's an existing product, it's to give you feedback because they already have a picture of what it does. If it's something brand new, it's much easier to be able to give them more visual feedback that they can look at and interact with. Welcome. Other questions? On the engineering side, the roadmap, that's hard to read. The roadmap turns into something like this. What this describes is each of these vertical columns is a sprint. And then in the sprint goal, it identifies the basic theme that's going to be fulfilled in that sprint. So when you have these themes that result in end user value, you can also use them to organize the stories and build sprints that accomplish that value as well. And then eventually you'll be able to fill in the features around each sprint as well. So this becomes more and more detailed. This is an example of a product roadmap after release planning has already been completed. So the features and then at least epic stories have already been defined for this one. But that's where the two sort of one translates into the other. At the business side, facing outward, it's timeframes and themes. Facing inside, it's goals and features with the timeline associated to it. So they're fairly similar, but they're somewhat different in the level of detail. And so before you plan to release, one of the complicated things is this communication of what's going to be delivered when. So just like at the beginning where I have clients say, I want to create Facebook for dogs, how much is it going to cost and when can you deliver it? As a product owner or a product manager, you get that same kind of question, like, are we on track? Can we deliver all of this in time? What's it going to cost me? So some of the best practices here, first is to talk as much as possible about the business value, about the themes, but not the specific implementation. To use a non-software example, if my objective is to get from here to Cartago and to be able to transport people between these two cities, then at this stage where I don't know any of the details of the plan, I'm really not sure what my budget is or time frame. I want to focus on the business value. We are going to provide rapid transportation between here and Cartago, but not get too prescriptive to say we're going to provide train transportation or helicopters or buses, because as soon as I start getting into the specific implementation and the features, then it ties you down. So when the engineering team comes back and says, "Hey, Paul, we've read about this really great maglev train, high-speed train technology that's really fast. We're going to go do that. Let's do it. Isn't it cool?" I'll say, "Yeah, sorry, I already promised everybody we're going to go by helicopter." So now I have to go back and say, "Oh, I was wrong. We're not going by helicopter. We're going by maglev train." And then I have to explain why we changed our minds. So as a product owner, it's safer if you can describe the value you're going to provide, what's the benefit to the end user, and to leave as much as possible of the specifics to later in the cycle. Also, it's important to understand MVP. Who's familiar with this term of MVP, minimum viable product? It's something. It's used quite often in the startup world. The idea here is to deliver the smallest product possible that people will see as viable or as useful, right? The smallest useful product that you can put in the market is a way to go from an agile perspective. So instead of spending a lot of time in analysis, building very big products and trying to figure out what people want along the way, it's a much more agile approach to take the smallest use case that people would find useful, build it, put it in the field, and release that product, and then iterate on it and pivot, add capabilities to it. Similar to, as I was saying before, it's easier for people to understand or envision what they want once they see the basic product. This MVP concept lends to that as well. Once you've delivered a base product, then it's going to be easier for you to get feedback. You'll have real users or not, right? You can put your MVP out there, you think you're going to have users, and suddenly you have none. That also tells you something.
Sure.
Yes?
What does MVP stand for?
Minimum viable product. Viable. So as a product owner, it's important to understand what's the minimum product that you must release in order for it to be attractive to the market. A couple of tools that I use in this case are data sheets or press releases. So I think about describing the product in terms of, if it were launching today, what would the press release say? What would I tweet about the product? What would I put on my website? What would it say about the product itself? So if those are the kinds of terms that you want to be able to use to describe a product in the early planning stages before you've really worked out the details. And then I introduce an idea here of the risk cut line. Even at this stage, you'll have an idea, a beautiful plan of what the product's going to be. Everything for years in the future, what it can grow to be. And what you need to understand with the MVP is where's the cut line in this stack of possible things that the release could have in it. Where is that cut line where if I include everything above the line, it's okay, because those other things are not essential. So where is that cut line? It's usually not a very clear answer, but you usually have an idea of that. And the best test that I have for answering this question is when you look at the product and you said, okay, if today I'm supposed to release in October, if it's October right now, and I had to release the product, which of these things could I live without? So if I was way behind and I had to throw something else overboard, what would it be? And those things would be below the cut line. And if I would delay the release, I would say, nope, it's just going to have to be November or December because this has to be in there, then those things are above the cut line. You would keep them in the release. So you determine where you think this line is, and this is a line that you'll want to keep following as the planning unfolds. Does that concept make sense of the release cut line?
I know that it's like a tricky question, but how difficult is to get that risk line with the client? The client always has to want it like all and now. The ship is good.
Mm-hmm.
But say like you don't have it all, it's like difficult with clients.
Yes.
How hard or how can let's rephrase a little bit. How should be the best way to approach the risk line with the client?
Yes. So this is one of the most difficult concepts, and when I'm faced, often what you'll see with whether it's a client or an investor or manager, I ask them, prioritize for me, which are the most important things? You want these 4 things, put them in order of importance. Oh, Paul, I can't do that. Those are all, every one of them is priority 1. They're all priority 1. Okay, all 4 of these are priority 1. You sure? Okay, yeah. All right, well, let me just tell you what you're saying to me. You're saying, Paul, I don't really care. You get to pick which one of these is priority 1. Because as a developer, I'm only going to be working on one thing at a time. So if you give me 4 things and they're all equal priority, that means I get to choose. So I would encourage you, Mr. Client or Mr. Boss or Mr. Investor, to tell me seriously, which one do you prefer? Do you have any preference at all, or do I get to pick? Sometimes that sort of turns on a light bulb and they realize that it's necessary. Sometimes it's the case where all 4 of those are MVP. And so what they're really saying is these 4 are all MVP. It doesn't really matter what order you do them in, because I'm going to need them all 4 by the end. And so that means all those are above the cut line. So then sometimes I'll ask the question of, okay, so if today were the deadline and we were running behind, are there any of these 4 that I could throw out, or we're over budget, either out of time or over budget? Are there any of these 4 that you would throw away to either get back on budget or to stay on schedule? Or if we're behind, we still have to do these 4, and you'll extend the budget or you'll extend the calendar. And if they truly are the MVP, the answer is we wouldn't like it, but we would extend the budget or we would extend the calendar. We would be unhappy, but we would do it because it's that important. So those are a couple of different ways that I have that conversation when I get that kind of, it's all priority 1. There is no cut line. You have to do everything. Welcome. The other important thing to note on this is most software projects don't accomplish 100% of their original plan. So if someone comes into a project, defines a project so that unless you accomplish 100% of it on the original schedule and on the original budget, that is a very high risk project. It's a very high risk project. And you're either risking the content or the schedule or the budget or all 3. So as a manager, as a business person, I like to try to manage risk and reduce risk. And one way to do that is to identify this risk cut line and say, okay, these are the really high risk items. They really, really have to be in there. I could probably live without these. And maybe I don't share that with everyone because I'm worried that somebody will say, okay, that means don't do them. But in my head, I want to have a plan B. I want to have an emergency plan if things don't work. And I use this risk cut line to sort of determine that. And if I have a plan where my plan is exactly the risk cut line and that's the plan for the release, I'm worried. I'm like biting my fingernails every day, looking, for additional resources or additional schedule. Question in the back?
Yeah. So during that communication release content meeting, or whatever
Mhm.
it's due. Does that mean that by that time you already have all the backlog estimated, so then you'll know when to run the basic timeline? Because from experience, I know that most of the time the backlog is some stuff they have in there, and you go screen to the screen and you do your backlog, running sessions and stuff, and then you put up stuff in there.
Yes. Yeah. At this stage, the risk cut line is more around the themes and the big picture of the project, because you're right, you don't have the backlog yet, but the risk cut line is something that will carry forward. So once you've elaborated down into user stories, then you assess your risk cut line again. And then once you do a sprint plan, you assess your risk cut line again. And so this is a tool that I encourage product owners to start thinking about even before release plan is complete, where you have user stories. Begin to sort of have, these are my really important themes, and these are my secondary themes, primary and secondary themes, or this is what my MVP is, and these are nice to have. So I think it's good to begin thinking about it here, but it gets revisited at every stage. And I actually, during delivery of product, I recommend that a product owner reevaluate that. Look at how the team is doing against the release plan, figure out what's the risk of meeting that cut line. Is the velocity looking pretty good? Looks like we're delivering everything and it's stable and we'll meet that, or we've run into some roadblocks, then I need to sort of move my cut line up a little bit and see, okay, maybe I need to start taking part of plan B and putting it into effect now. So it's a tool that I recommend starting here and then implementing as well as once you add the detail into the release plan. Which is the next piece. So we haven't even gotten onto this picture yet. We were talking about roadmap and themes. We don't really have a full product backlog. Maybe we have epics, but not down at a user story level. But in release planning, you've got to get down to this level user story. And here's where we actually revisit the user story again in more detail to look at the criteria of what makes a good user story. So now you're taking the themes and the basic business plan, and you're trying to break down a plan for one release, one block on that roadmap. And this invest model is a good way to test the user stories. Independent, meaning that whenever possible, your user stories stand alone. There aren't dependencies on other user stories. If you have dependencies on user stories, try to build them as a stack, not in parallel, but have them operate serially so that you can complete the step one of the story before you complete the user stories on top of it. As an example, in developing mobile applications, we will often build the web services features one sprint ahead of the user interface on the mobile handset. So we'll build the web services, we'll test them in a test harness to make sure that they're responding the way they're supposed to, and then in the next sprint, we'll build the mobile pieces, the user interface that accesses those web services. Negotiable is important just to be able to take advantage of the creative ideas within the team. So the idea behind negotiable is the user story is defined in a way that is not too prescriptive, that it gives the engineering team some opportunity to contribute to the solution, to how you might accomplish that. So the example earlier of traveling from here to Cartago, to keep it at a level where we can have a discussion about what's the right architecture, what's the right mechanism for accomplishing this goal. So leave some room for negotiation and discussion so that the entire team you can benefit from the creative ideas of the entire team. Valuable, going back to the value test that I mentioned earlier. is there end user value somewhere in this? Is it clear in the story what value is being delivered to the end user? So why would they care? Why would a user be excited, or a buyer of the system be excited about this particular story? That one's quite difficult sometimes, especially if you're doing like web services for a client application. So the end user is not really going to be excited about web services because they don't use web services. They use a mobile application. But if you can look at it and see, okay, ultimately I see what value it will contribute to. It's part of the value chain. That's really the idea. So if you can see a clear tie to the value chain for the user, that's important for the user story. Estimable, meaning that it's specific enough that you can estimate it. So it has enough content. The team can look at it, can talk with you, and they can do an estimate based on it. And then small and testable, I'll dig into just a little bit more, but you want to try to keep the size of the stories small enough that they can fit into a sprint, and that they're not too overwhelming for the team. And testable is the idea that for any story that you have, you want to be able to know what the definition of done is. So how do you know that it's actually finished and meets the objective that was set out at the very beginning? I'll talk just a little bit about size, because this is an area that gets complicated. Again, it's sort of an art to figure out how big, when is an epic too big? When is a story too small? At the small end, the story can be too small if it really restricts the implementation, if it's so specific that there's really no creativity left for the developers in their implementation. If you make it too big, on the other hand, the user story could become unclear, can be too fuzzy. Like I'm gonna travel from San Jose to some other city somewhere. It's a little too big, a little too epic, because you have no idea, am I just traveling local? Am I traveling international, across continents, outer space? I don't know. The solution's going to be different. So making sure that there's enough clarity to be able to do it. And then the bigger the story gets, the harder it gets to fit into a sprint. I like to use a rule of thumb of setting user stories that are more or less a day's worth of effort, because it keeps it from being like spending a bunch of time writing stories for every 1 hour of work that you're going to do. It's just a ton of paperwork. But if you write stories that are like 2 weeks in length, you're not really sure how you're doing until 2 or 3 weeks passes. So a story that's about one day of work, more or less, is a pretty good measure of story size. So, if it's 3 days, it's fine. If it's half a day, it's good. But if it starts to really move far away from that, it starts to become more complicated, more overhead, and more risk involved. Any questions on story size? Scope? And then the other important piece when it comes to planning is the prioritization. We talked a little bit about this already, that the team will eventually pull stories off in some order. As a product owner, product manager, it's to your advantage to define that priority so that you can be sure that the most important things get done first. So if you have to hit that risk cut line, that the effort has gone into stories that are above the cut line. If if effort has gone into stories that are below the cut line and you have to go to plan B, you're throwing away work. You're having to cut away things that were affected and already done. So, so using that prioritization and feeding the priorities into the product backlog is important. Don't drive your car off a cliff. As I talked before, if you provide multiple priority ones, it means there is no priority one. If there's 4, that means the developer gets to choose. Another one that's probably the most important here is at the bottom. If you prioritize things right, keep in mind your goal is to be, you would rather be 100% finished on 80% of the features, not 80% finished on 100% of the features, because then you can't ship anything. So by prioritizing the stories, you're defining that that risk, and you're making sure that some capabilities in the product are 100% complete. I also include a couple of items for thought, especially for existing products, that you do need to include stories for refactoring and improving the infrastructure of the application. If all stories are focused 100% on customer value, over time that leads to brittle or high-risk software. And then set your priority at sprint planning, at release planning. Try not to reprioritize within the sprint, because you create chaos within the team. I see heads nodding. It never happens, right? But if you set a plan and then 3 days later the plan changes, and 3 days later the plan changes again, it upsets the cadence and the sequence and the productivity. So set the near-term priorities very clearly. The priority for next month, you don't have to worry too much about it. The priority for this sprint, make sure it's really clear and that you've put enough thought into it. And the final slide, when you're at this stage, you've completed a release plan, you have the detailed stories, they're all prioritized and slotted into sprints. Now you have a different level that you can communicate about your release plan. So you can still use themes to describe it, but one of the beauties of now is, as you actually deliver software, you have some stories that are working and completed. Now you can put the very specific features in there. If you've designed the high-speed rail connection between here and Cartago and you have the first prototype train running on that rail, now you can start announcing it's going to be this high-speed maglev technology. You're going to be amazed. But at this stage, once you just have a plan, still stay with themes until you actually have those pieces delivered. Then you can convert from themes into very specific features and implementations. Continue to keep a running tally. This is that cut line, the risk line of what's above the line and what's below the line. When you get into the actual plan and operation of it, it's going to get blurry in there. So I generally have 3 categories instead of it's in or it's out. I have it's definitely in, it might be in, and it's probably not going to make it. And when that way, as a product owner, if you keep track of the things that fall into those 3 buckets, if suddenly something moves into the not going to make it bucket, and you've promised that to somebody, you can go back and manage that commitment. And you can say, hey, Mr. Customer, we ran into a problem. This feature has moved from it's not very likely to it's impossible. So I wanted you to know about that. Do we need to renegotiate the schedule or the budget, or if it moves from it's definitely in to it's somewhat at risk, to have that discussion as well, so that It's not just, hey, last week it was in, but this week's out. Never, it's done. That people will deal with it better if it goes from, I'm guaranteeing it's in, hey, wait a minute, something happened and I'm not so sure anymore. And then it either goes back up to, I'm sure, or no, it's out. But it tends to bring people into the conversation and help them feel a part of the discussion, the problem solving. If they have a chance where they see something teetering on the edge of disaster, they may have other alternatives. They may say, hey, can we add some people? Can we bring in some special expertise? Is there anything we can do to make it go from risky to it's definitely in? You can have that conversation, so everybody has a chance to give input and try to rescue it if they're really passionate about it, or decide that, yeah, okay, I guess I can live without it, so I'll let it go. All right, that's everything I have. Do you have any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, based on your experience with this methodology, where the user is and how you can define this as value. Why I'm asking this? Well, I have the experience to lead one of the most important projects in my company that I work. Everything was a success, right? At the end, the user was not ready to use the product that we developed.
Okay.
So from business perspective and from project perspective, everything was defined of the legal value of the product, all our releases, all our ethics, how we identified and the safety for all our risks.
Yes.
But at the end, the user was not ready. Where is user experience design for this?
Well, there's two different dimensions to that, and I'll address both of them. So from the user perspective, it happens where you have a theory about what the user needs, but in the end, what you build is, even though you followed the plan and the vision perfectly, it turns out that their need is different. That's one reason why going for an MVP as an investment is a better decision. So build a smaller amount. Then if you're wrong with a smaller decision. But from a product owner standpoint, and I've got a whole series of training on this for product owners. It's important not to get out with the client and stay in touch with what their actual needs are, and to keep the lines of communication to the end user as close as possible. For different applications, that means different things. For a consumer application, it means having a public beta and getting feedback from users in that way. For an enterprise application, it may be having one or two pilot customers that they say, yes, I want to be an early adopter of this, and I'm interested in looking at it early and giving you feedback along the way. But it's very important. The more customer input you have into this process, the better. It's just difficult. It's time consuming to get that feedback, and difficult to keep the conversation going. But one step is to try to avoid that by having as much customer interaction as possible. If you're building a brand new product especially, but it can be true of all products, providing some concepts or mock-ups or workflows, and this is where user experience comes into play, to get user feedback. Sometimes in the process of just evaluating the user experience, you'll determine that you're not really solving the right business problem, right? They'll say, yeah, Paul, the workflow is easy, but the destination isn't where I want to be. So I'm okay with the user experience. It's all good and it flows logically, but it doesn't really do what I want. What I really want is this. So the two can work together, and to do some user experience modeling, to do wireframes or workflows that then you take to prospective users and say, here's what we're going to build, here's the business logic and how it's going to flow. Gives you not only user experience feedback, but it also gives you validation of the user stories and the priorities, and some confidence that when you finally do build it, they'll say, yeah, that's what I thought you were going to deliver, and I'm still on track with it. So the two can work together very nicely.
Do I still have to plan for going into the project? For example, I mean, at the end of the project, we receive user experience scores.
Okay.
And that's what the teachers teach us. Was the user experience modeling was pretty easy. It wasn't time consuming. For example, it was a web application and also a mobile application.
Yes.
And it was pretty easy to just sketch with a pencil and a white paper, right?
Right.
How the application that we were going to develop was going to be.
Yes.
So, and the users can also interact with it.
Right.
You don't have to read a computer and make changes in the papers.
Right.
We made it in about 4 hours.
Yes.
It was pretty good.
Yeah, what I think what is common practice is really at a release level to do the mock-up and user experience. So early in the release, you mock up the entire workflow and user experience for that whole release. The tricky part, the dangerous part is sometimes in modeling out the user experience, then you also end up describing the implementation. And so it's also important to try to get the development input into the user experience flow so that you're designing something that can actually be built easily. And it all depends, right? If a developer is doing the user experience design, they already sort of know what's possible with the framework or the platform. But if you have a pure UX person that's more from a visual design background, they may not know what's possible with iOS or Android or PHP or whatever the framework that you're using. So when you're doing that user experience work, it's important to make sure that there's a technical advisor who understands the framework and the implementation, who can advise, hey, wait, that's going to be really, really hard to do because of the platform, so that you don't get your hands tied where the customer says, I really wanted that, thing to transition, whatever. It's easy to end up painting yourself in a corner if you're not careful.
Very happy to get that. Very, very fast.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions? All right. Yes.
Once you finish, they finish with all the questions.
Mhm.
Let them know that they can go through the auditorium.
Into
for the
auditorium.
raffle.
Okay.
For the raffle.
All right. Excellent. So thank you again for being here. I appreciate your time. I hope it was useful for you. Reminder that the next session in Auditorium B will be the raffle, so you don't want to miss that. And thank you again for coming.